A pivotal year approaches for Shane Beamer and the South Carolina Gamecocks. Helping us break down the 2024 season in Columbia, our good friend Chris Marler of Locked On Gamecocks. He joined the show. Chris, what's going on, my friend? And let me go ahead and address the elephant in the room. I don't think it's lost on anyone how ironic it is that I, the SEC man, am talking to you, the South Carolina guy.
Yeah.
What's up, man?
Not much, man. I appreciate you having me on. It's what a role reversal. Listen, I will tell you this: those fans miss you. They miss you a lot, and they talk about you all the time. So you feel free to stop by anytime, and say hey. It is a fun bunch. It is a fun bunch. I'll say that. No, it's been fun, man. I've lived in Columbia off and on for a long time, and so getting to cover like a hometown team is a blast, and it should be it's an interesting season coming up.
Mm-hmm. Also, by the way, Chris, I want to say congrats to you. Obviously, big news. You're covering practically the entire SEC this season as well with the next round stuff that happened. If you want to expand on the stuff with the guys down in Baton Rouge, you're everywhere, man. So congrats on the success, man. You deserve it.
Thanks, dude. I appreciate it. Yeah, I'll be home base will be Columbia as of now, and then I'll probably we'll be going to Atlanta soon with some other stuff. It's non-football related, and I don't think the girlfriend's listening, but when we'll see that stuff flourish soon. But anyway, no, I'm doing Locked On Gamecocks, like I said, for South Carolina, and then we just announced today we'll be working with with Next Round Live as well, based out of Birmingham. Me and Clint Lane will be doing a show about Alabama there, which will be a ton of fun. Very, very, very excited about that. And then also still working for ESPN 104.5 in Baton Rouge, as well as this new venture we're launching there, LouisianaSports.net, and covering the SEC as a whole for that website. So very excited.
Love that, Chris. Excited to follow along. That said, let's talk about South Carolina. Before we look ahead, Chris, let's look back, if you will, on 2023, kind of how we got into this position. There was a lot of hype coming into last year. You'd beaten Tennessee. You had beaten Clemson. You go into that first game against North Carolina, and that was really the tone setter for what we saw the rest of the year. 5-7, 3-5 in conference play. You miss out on a bowl game in year 3 of Shane Beamer. When South Carolina fans look back on year 3 of the Beamer era, like what's the first thing that comes to mind, and what's the overall feeling about the year that was in 2023?
Well, so it's disappointing. I think one thing the SEC fans don't ever do of any team, and you and I have talked about this off air, on air, everything in between. They don't manage their expectations well at all. And I kept saying this. This is the Texas A&M syndrome of, hey, like you closed out the season really well. You beat Clemson, you beat Tennessee. No one can take that away from you. That's huge. 2 of the best games of the season. That was awesome. But let's pump the brakes a little bit in terms of expectations of what you got coming back, because there's still a lot of holes on this roster of what you're trying to compete with in and out, or week in and week out in the SEC. And I think the 2 biggest ones that kept coming up was the trenches. And this is, I always say this, 3 things I hate the most: ISIS, yellow starbursts, and people that like them, and cliches. And this cliche of listen, the SEC is won and lost in the trenches. It's very real. And you look at South Carolina's offensive line and defensive line, and it was arguably the worst combined units in the entire conference. Right off the bat, you were up the UNC game, you give up 9 sacks. You give up 9 sacks in that game against UNC, and that was I want to say it was around 40% of what they had produced a year before for the entire season in that Gene Chizik defense in Chapel Hill. So, that offensive line was really tough. The defensive line did not get up to quarterback. You were last in the SEC. You've ranked 11th or worse in the SEC in terms of sacks, allowed and getting sacks in 3 of the last 4 years. You have to be better up front. I do think that you look at it and it's oh man, it's an uphill battle. No one outside of Columbia is giving South Carolina a chance. No one. It's hilarious to me, because it's every year we think we know everything that's going to be factual, and this is exactly what's going to happen in the season. Again, Texas A&M syndrome, where it's we just assume that this is going to be the year they turn the corner, or they're going to be 5-7 or 4-8. There's not a single game on Carolina's schedule that people are looking at as a toss-up. Yeah, they might win that one. Everything is no, I see 4-5 total, and that's it. So that's the thing I'm most excited for this season, because I love that expectations are lower. It's like how I always approach dating. If you have lower expectations, we will have a higher success rate, I guarantee.
Chris, let's talk Shane Beamer entering his 4th season. It's been interesting. Shane Beamer, like many others, but he's one of those coaches, when things are going well, you could argue there's nobody more fun to watch and listen to in college football. When things aren't going well, again, Chris, we've seen this before. It's like any other coach. When you're not winning, some of the things that people love you for are some of the same reasons people will dislike you for.
Yep.
Stuff at the podium, post-game comments, antics, people will call it, whatever it is. Either way, there's still a lot of goodwill around Shane Beamer. Again, you beat Clemson. I feel like that gives you a couple of years. That's how big of a deal it is to win that rivalry game. But either way, I think it's fair to say the seat is warming coming in the 4th season.
Yeah.
I mean, just talk about Shane Beamer. What is the overall vibe from the fan base and how they feel about Beamer ball in Columbia?
Well, so I think that Clemson game does go a long way. I think you're foolish if you're saying that there isn't a hot seat that he could potentially be on. Because if he goes 4-8 or goes 5-7 again, that's not what we're looking for here, right? Like you have to win games at some point. Now, I will say, this year I look at Shane Beamer, I almost look at him like Gus Malzahn when he had Bo Nix in year 1, where it's like you hit your wagon to a younger quarterback. LaNorris Sellers is going into his first year. I think that he can be a very good college quarterback. I really do. You have no returning production from the receiver standpoint, but I do like where that is, like those position units and where the team in general, the roster in general, are heading. So it's like I don't think this is a make or break year. It shouldn't be, at least. But it is the SEC, and you see how people, how logical people can be. And when I say that, I'm being very, very facetious. I'll say last year, I kept calling Shane Beamer Skinny Sam Pittman. I was like, because people, I thought everyone loved him. Mm-hmm. And then you watch the season go on, and you're like, oh, no, that is not the case. Kirby hates him for sure. Luckily, that season on the schedule. But I think that, there are some things that are frustrating about Shane Beamer when he talks in front of a camera, and because I think he's passionate. I don't think he always says the right stuff, which, listen, man, you give me that much time from a microphone, I'm probably going to screw up. I get that. I think some accountability is what's sometimes missing from Shane Beamer. And I think he does understand the pressure, and I think he's up for it. I wonder what that looks like, because, dude, again, this is when I talk about Oklahoma and Texas coming to the SEC, the first thing I thought of when they announced it in 2021 was, man, that's going to lower the ceiling for what was already above some of these programs. The 3 that always stand out to me is Mississippi State, Kentucky, South Carolina. Can be good programs, can win 9 or 10 games every once in a while, but also, history shows us what they are, and it's usually 7-5. And I think that those 2 programs coming in lowers that ceiling a little bit more. I hope that's not the case for Beamer, and I hope he gets a fair shake. But you are going into year 4, man. You're going into year 4, and I don't know how high that ceiling can be, because you see what it can do for a guy like Drink, who had 3 losing seasons and 11 wins. I don't know if that's what's in line for Beamer this year.
So, Chris, let's talk this 2024 Gamecocks football team. We'll start on the offensive side of the football. QB1, wide receiver 1, and RB1 from last year all depart. But LaNorris Sellers takes over as QB1, and there is a lot of excitement around this kid. Robbie Ashford, notably, by the way, from Auburn, is QB2. So the quarterback room in good standing. Again, a lot of questions around Sellers being a young guy, but a lot of excitement and hype as well. Right. The running game is going to be revamped. You averaged 85.1 yards per game rushing in the SEC last year, which was by far the worst mark. But again, you revamped that room. Rocket Sanders from Arkansas, Oscar Attaway from North Texas, Jawarn Howell from South Carolina State. You add them to the room. You mentioned the wide receiver position, Chris. The big question, I think, is will Nick Harbor break out this season, step up, be that guy? But you added other pieces, right? Gage Larvadain from Miami, Ohio, Jared Brown from Coastal Carolina, Amari Huggins-Bruce from Louisville. There's many others. Maz Bennett, who is a freshman. There's a lot of different guys, a lot of bodies, but not a lot of proven commodities there. Joshua Simon, Brady Hunt are going to give you, I think, a solid tight end duo, especially Simon, who was pretty good last year. And then 4 of 5 starters return on the offensive line, Chris. There's one of 2 ways to look at this. One is there's a lot of talent coming back, and they should be better. The other way is 4 of 5 are back from a unit that gave up 41 sacks a season ago, and again, paved the way for 85 yards per game rushing in the SEC. So when you look at South Carolina offensively, Chris, It's a new era, obviously. No more Spencer Rattler under
Right.
center. You go with LaNorris Sellers. What are you expecting from Dowell Loggins' offense and that offensive attack in Columbia this season?
So I love LaNorris Sellers. I think that LaNorris Sellers has a chance to be one of those quarterbacks that we look at that's like a 3-year starter that is not going to necessarily be like an NFL stud or a high round draft pick or anything like that, but a very, very good college quarterback. I think he could fit that mold easily for the next 3 years. Very physical. And I'll tell you this, man, you get Rocket Sanders back. He's lost like 22 to 28 pounds, something like that. And he's coming off an injury, but by all means, that's a former all SEC running back when he was at Arkansas, right? And you got some depth there that you brought in at running back as well. The thing at receiver, your two highest returning receivers from a production standpoint is Luke Doty and Nick Harbor, and they have 25 combined catches. Now, one of those guys was close to making the Olympics. One of those guys is probably going to end up being on The Bachelor at some point in his career. Like, that's the trajectory we're talking about. I like where they're at, because if you look at the history of South Carolina, it doesn't really, like, over the last 10 years especially, I don't think it's as big of a deal, because you're going to throw the football. Somebody is going to get those numbers. Juice Wells left, you could say 2 years ago, because he sat out all of last year, and then you look up and see Xavier Legette go up and get 300 more yards than him, and however many more catches in the season, and also more touchdowns. Like, the production increased even without Juice Wells from a year ago. If you look at the history of South Carolina, that position, there's always a guy that comes in and steps up, like always. And the year before, it's almost like an unheard of. Like, I'm not saying they have a Xavier Legette who's a first-round draft pick at receiver. What I am saying is that you have tons of bodies in that room. You've got some really good production at the G5 level coming in. I appreciate you pronouncing all of their names for me, so I don't have to, because I've struggled with that a lot. And I hope it's Nick Harbor. I really do, because I'm still in the camp of you get your best players to football as much as possible. And I think that when he steps on the field, I say this about Jalen Miller all the time, but it applies to Nick Harbor. When he steps on the field, he is the best athlete on the field, no matter what color jersey he is wearing. So figure out a way to get him 7 to 8, 9, 10 targets a game. I think that you have to try to do that. Now, the other part is the offensive line, like you brought up. They have been abysmal the past several years. I think this is the first time in the program in a while that you're going to see two position units that were like absolute liabilities a year ago in terms of the defensive backs. And you remember that Mississippi State game? Mm-hmm. Jesus. I mean, and then you talk about the offensive line. I think that those two position units could be the strengths of this team, which sounds crazy considering how bad they were a year ago, especially the offensive line. But I really do think that they have a chance to be strengths of this team. And it's not just the 4 or 5 starters you got returning. It's the depth that you've added. It's the former high 4-star, some 5-star recruit Josiah Thompson coming in. Like, where is he going to get reps? And having multiple guys that, like, across the front line that can play multiple positions. You got some versatility up there. This is what I keep looking at, man, is if you're up 17-14 going into the fourth quarter, right? And because that defense is going to be good. We'll get to it, I'm sure, in a second, but that defense is going to be good. If you're up 17-14 in the fourth quarter and you're trying to eat some clock and keep the defense, like off the field and keep the other offense off the field, you've got Rocket Sanders. You've got Robbie Ashford that you can bring in some capacity, right? And then you've also got LaNorris Sellers. Both those quarterbacks at 6'3", 240, Rocket Sanders at 230, like, lean on people and be able to eat up yards late in game. That's something that South Carolina hasn't had in a couple of years, and I think they're going to have this year.
Chris, you mentioned the defense. That was one of the most puzzling things a season ago, right? It was a unit and a group that there was talent, but it didn't click until the final month of the season, just kind of inexplicably. You mentioned that Mississippi State game. Who can forget the Florida game where you fell apart late? I mean, Missouri was a no-show. So defensively, you saw South Carolina go from a 4.25 to a 3.35. I'm curious if that's going to be something they stick with. There are multiple. How does Clayton White approach that? And again, Clayton White, a guy feeling pressure this year, certainly.
Yeah,
but defensively, as he should. Alex Huntley, Tonka Hemingway, TJ Sanders are all back up front. You've got Dylan Stewart, a young freshman looking to shine off the edge. Gilbert Edmond is back in town from Florida State. So there's talent up front. Debo Williams leading the linebacker room, probably one of the most underrated players in the SEC.
Without a doubt.
Bam Martin-Scott right next to him. 4 of 5 return in the secondary, led by Nick Eamon-Warry and DQ Smith at safety. And I think South Carolina, Chris, and you can expand on this, but from the folks I've talked to over the past couple months, they believe they've improved the athleticism on defense via the portal. Guys like Demetrius Knight Jr., who was at Georgia Tech and then Charlotte, DeAndre Jules from Pitt, Bangali Kamara from Pitt, replacing some guys like Pup Howard, Stone Blanton, and some others that left. They feel like they've gotten actually more athletic and quicker, especially at linebacker. So, again, like you mentioned, you're high on the defense. Tell me why and what you like about this group going into 2024.
So I don't think they're going to be in 3-3-5 as much as they think. I think that because here's the thing: you got to get your best athletes on the field, right? You've got some depth up front, and the defensive end position is a massive upgrade from what it was a year ago. Like Kennard from Georgia Tech is the guy that went out and got 6 sacks in a Power 5 level. If Dylan Stewart can be anything, like if Dylan Stewart can go get you 5 sacks, like, and here's the thing too, that's a defense that only got 21 sacks a year ago. They were last in the SEC in that. They were ranked like 105th in the country. They might get a quarter or a third of that production in week 1 against Old Dominion, because Old Dominion gave up 61 sacks last year, 63 sacks. It is the most in the country, right? And I think it's important to get off to a good start and get into situations where you can pin your ears back. I think the flex nickel defense that Clayton White is going to run with the 4-2-5 and the 3-3-5, it makes more sense to me to stay in the 4-2-5 strictly because you have more depth up front than you do in the middle of that defense. The back 5 should be really good. Like the back 6, if you want to just look at the 5 defensive backs and also Debo Williams, like they are going to be very, very good. And you're right about Debo Williams. He's one of the most underrated players in the entire country, definitely the conference. And there's some guys that can run, man. Like Demetrius Knight Jr., guy that was clocked over 21 miles an hour in the offseason. Like if he can tackle, like let him get in space. Like that's the kind of stuff that like I think is perfect for that 4-2-5. Again, like, I mean, there's a Tonka Hemingway's a guy that we're not talking a lot about. Like Alex Huntley is, like plug them in the middle. And I think they should be better because this defensive line was pretty porous at times last year, especially against the run. But in this day and age of what you see in football, I think that the flex nickel can work. I'll tell you another thing. The positives from Clayton White's defense, not a ton that we've seen consistently over 3 years. But they do lead the SEC in turnovers forced in the last 3 years. There was I think it's like 63. But here's my only concern with that, Chris, is that 17 of those from last year were in the red zone. I thought that had to be a record. I was like, that's absurd. You turned over opponents 17 times in the red zone. Like it was only second in the SEC. But I mean, does that transfer over and translate into another year? Because that's usually like a stat that doesn't travel from year to year. And like, if you were good at it the year before, it does not mean that all of a sudden you're good. It's like close wins, right? Like just because you had a bunch the year before, that usually means you're going to have a drop off. I don't know if that'll happen or not because they've been consistent turning people over, but you're going to have to do that again because you need to get this offense as much short field situations as possible, I would think.
Chris, let's talk special teams. That's always a hot topic in Columbia. Hey, you better get used to talking special teams. I'll tell you that. I thought one of the things that sort of evaded South Carolina a season ago, they need to get back the magic of Beamer ball, if you will. It felt like in the first 2 years, there was always a big play on special teams, block punt, block kick, punt return, kickoff return, right? We saw South Carolina steal some wins that way. Not so much a year ago. Not that it was bad, but it just wasn't special, right? So can they get back to that? You do lose Pete Limbo. That's kind of an interesting storyline coming in. He takes a head coaching job. Alex Herrera taking over at kicker after Mitch Jeter transferred to Notre Dame. Kai Kroger is back at punter. He's one of the best in the SEC. And then the return game, going to be interesting to see who steps up there. So I'm sure, Chris, you've spent all offseason studying special teams for South Carolina. Just thoughts on Beamer ball and can it be special again? Because it feels like it needs to be for South Carolina to get closer to that ceiling you mentioned.
Well, don't sleep on Kai Kroger. Kai Kroger could probably start at quarterback at Auburn. I'll say that.
Got a heck of a golf swing, too.
Does he? I mean,
he does. Check his Instagram. Heck of a golf swing.
I'll check it out. But, yes, he's like 7 of 8 career passing with multiple touchdowns. The limbo thing sucks. I think you're losing a guy that had, he was behind like 14 block kicks while he was there and all that kind of stuff. Bringing in DeCamillis from Texas, I like it. And also, if you talk to anybody close to Texas, very, very high on him. Like very, very high on him. He wasn't the main special teams coach. He was the assistant to the guy that married the stripper who had the monkey that bit that kid, which is one of the most factual and wildest things that's ever come out of my mouth. And factual, let me repeat. But no, DeCamillis, I think they could be good there. It sucks losing Jeter. I think that's a really big thing, losing that kind of consistency at the field goal kicking position. But we'll see. Like I think that like South Carolina, it's also seems like it's always been a program that has been able to have somewhat good kickers, like dating back all the way back to Ryan Suckup and guys that can like not just have range, but consistency as well. So hopefully that does travel. I think you want to be in a situation where the block kick thing is huge. If you can figure out a way to turn the field over and pin people deep, especially, that's massive. I saw a stat the other day that was like if you block a kick, you have a 90% chance of winning that game. Mm-hmm. Like that's just like a historical, I guess, fact. Like the only time you don't is if you jump off sides in a national championship game against Alabama. Just throwing that in there. But no, it is like that's how important that is. So yeah, can you get back to doing that more? You also want to be in a position, man. Like I think the in the grand scheme of things, it'd be awesome to be great in all three phases of the game. Mm-hmm. Like that's what all elite teams do. But it would be nice to not have to depend on those things, right? Like for real. Like that's the goal. Is like you don't want it to be in a situation where you're dependent upon like, God, we better block a kick here, or we better be able to recover like a surprise onside or whatever. Like those type of things are great to have in your arsenal, but it's even better if you don't have to be completely reliant on them.
So, Chris, 11 starters returned for South Carolina, 4 on offense, 7 on defense. Tons of new transfer portal pieces and freshmen will make impact as well. And as we look at the 2024 schedule, you mentioned you sort of ease into the season, a nice season opener against Old Dominion at home. It gets real very quickly. You're at Kentucky week 2. You got LSU week 3. Akron then comes to town. Then the month of October kicks in. Juice Wells and the Ole Miss Rebels come to Columbia. You're at Bama, at Oklahoma, Texas A&M at home, at Vanderbilt, Mizzou at home, Wofford at home, and then at Clemson. When you look at that 2024 slate, what jumps out to you?
I mean, so the schedule, I keep saying this, the schedule is the schedule. Like it's like, it's tough. You're not playing divisions this year, so you don't get Tennessee, you don't get Georgia, you don't get Florida. In a year where you probably wish you could get Florida, right? Like, so I think that part is interesting. The October slate of back-to-back games of Ole Miss at Oklahoma at Bama is probably one of the toughest 3-game slates in the entire country all season. I keep going to this. I was getting yelled at by Carolina fans early on. So like, we don't give a crap about this Kentucky game. Like, we're not losing to Kentucky. It's like, well, you lost 5 of 6 to Kentucky not that long ago. So I look at LSU and Ole Miss and Missouri. And I kept saying this at the start of the show. There's not a single game on that schedule that people outside of Columbia are looking at like, that's a toss-up. They could pull an upset here. South Carolina is going to win one of those 3 games. They are going to beat LSU, Ole Miss, or Missouri. They are going to win one of those games. And you look at some of the numbers, like everyone we believe what we want to believe. It's a confirmation bias going into the season like we see every year. But let me just give you a stat, okay? And I brought this up earlier. Missouri on the road before last year was like 3-13. 3-13 in the first 3 years under Eli Drinkwitz. They went 5-1 last year in road games or neutral sites. So that's 8-14 under Drinkwitz on the road outside of Como. LSU is 8-10, I believe, 8-10 over the last 3 years on the road. Ole Miss is 11-8. Those 2 teams combined are just over 500. And you get them very early on in the season. The 8 losses that Ole Miss has, the 8 losses they've had away from home, are by an average of 20 points per game. Like a year ago, it was like 25 points per game. Like that offense has not traveled to different places. And by the way, let's be very clear here. In true road games for Ole Miss over the last 2 years, they only have 1 win over a team that finished the winning record, and that was Tulane. So coming to Williams-Brice and having to get into that I was going to say snake pit, but you could say cockpit, and like what that stadium can be. Again, LSU 8-10 in road games for the last 3 years. Ole Miss significantly worse on the road than they are at home. Like they are going to jump up and get one of those games, and they're going to be bowl eligible. I feel like they're going to at least win 6. I think that 6-6 is reasonable, but if they can get up and if they can finish the month of September at 3-1 or even 4-0 somehow, the hype around South Carolina going into the month of October, it might get washed out pretty quick with that schedule. But it would be huge to get off to that kind of start for Shane Beamer.
So, Chris, on that note, you mentioned you believe South Carolina can and will be bowl eligible. What's the key for that to happen? What has to click? And bonus question, we've seen quarterbacks come through Columbia with a lot of hype, a lot of high hopes, and then fizzle out.
Right.
LaNorris Sellers is the latest, not saying he's going to be like that. How good do you think LaNorris Sellers can be, and what are realistic expectations for him in this offense? Because as you know, I'm sure, talking to the fan base, they think the kid's going to win the Heisman. So, I mean, like, what are realistic expectations? And, again, the key for South Carolina to hit that 6-win mark at minimum and go bowling.
So you got to win the games you're supposed to win, right? You cannot have any slip-ups there. And then I think the other part is like you got to protect your home field because it's, again, those 3 games that you get them all at home. Like, it's going to be tough to go beat
Texas A&M at home, too.
I don't know why I thought that. I mean, that's –
yeah.
It would be nice to be Texas A&M. I'm not going to get my hopes up for that one, considering the history of that rivalry. But I mean, like, those are all games that are very, very difficult. Like, dude, let's think about this: the A&M thing. You brought A&M. A&M is favored at home against Mizzou, Notre Dame, and LSU. All 3 of those teams are ranked inside like top 12. They're favored at home. You get them at home as they're going to be having to go on the road with a first-year head coach. So there's plenty of opportunity. I think you have to win the games you're supposed to win. You can't have a slip up against Vandy or anything like that. And then you got to go jump up and get somebody. I don't know if that's Clemson. I don't know if that's, if it's one of the 3 or 4 we just mentioned. But I do think that they are going to get bowl eligible. And I think that look, I tell you what, I don't know if Sellers is going to win a Heisman, but give him a 5th of something the night before that Bama game in Tuscaloosa, because it's worked wonders for quarterbacks in the past. I mean, if he can have a hangover against Alabama, they will beat Bama by 2 touchdowns. That's just history will repeat itself. That's what I've learned.
Fair point. Very fair point. Chris Marler, Locked On Gamecocks, does a fantastic job. Chris, let folks know where they can check out all your work.
Yeah, man. I appreciate you having me on. It is Locked On Gamecocks, Locked On SC, I believe, on social media. And then we're starting the show next Monday with Next Run Live, covering the SEC and Alabama with Clint Lamb. And then obviously ESPN 104.5 in Baton Rouge as well. Vern Funquist CFB on Instagram and Twitter. And that's about it.
Chris, final thing. What's more likely, South Carolina wins 9 games, or you make it through this college football season with the same Twitter account?
I think it's me with the Twitter account. I think I've learned my lesson. I think I've learned my lesson. But I will also tell you, there's multiple people that I told someone today. I was like, "You're gonna make me lose my Twitter account because of something I'm gonna say to you." It's like, and then like I was like joking, but yeah. That's a good question. That's fair.
Chris, you're the man. It's always a pleasure. I appreciate you taking the time, and let's definitely do it again soon.
Sounds good, brother.